My name is Howard. I'm 25 years old, and I live on my family's farm in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas. It's not a commercial farm, just a little family property my parents have poured their lives into. They've been pretty clear about their hopes for me to take over one day, as I'm the oldest of three and their only son. But honestly, I don't see that happening. Farm life isn't really for me. I can't imagine spending my whole life out here, especially after what happened last July. A night that still makes me uneasy. My parents had gone on a romantic getaway for a week, leaving the responsibility of the farm to me and my two younger sisters, Crystal and Morgan. Crystal's in college and takes online summer courses, so she spent most of her time locked in her room on her laptop. Morgan and I hung out in the living room, killing time by watching some random show on TV. None of us are exactly attached to the farm life. If anything, we've all talked about wanting to leave it behind. I mean, isolation has its perks, lots of privacy, but it also comes with drawbacks, like predators. And I don't just mean animals. I'm talking about people, trespassers. You'd think in a place like this, you'd be safe from that, but it's happened a few times over the years. People sneaking onto the property to steal produce or just causing trouble. We keep a few guns in the house for situations like that. I'd never had to deal with one of those situations before, at least not until that night. It was getting late, and we were all winding down for bed when the dogs started barking like crazy out back. We have two outdoor dogs, and when they go off like that, you know something's up. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to see what had them so riled up. Both dogs were facing the cornfield, barking their heads off. I yelled for them to calm down, and they went quiet, but only for a moment. That's when I heard it, a whistle coming from the cornfield. A low, deliberate whistle, unmistakably human. My heart started pounding. I had never dealt with a trespasser without my dad there. The realization that I was the one who'd have to handle this hit me like a ton of bricks. I sprinted back into the house and grabbed one of the guns we keep locked up. I told my sisters someone was out in the cornfield. Both of them immediately told me I was crazy if I thought I was going in there alone. And they were right. The idea of walking into that dark cornfield with some stranger lurking in there sent chills down my spine. Instead, I went back outside and stood by the dogs. I fired a shot into the air, hoping it would scare whoever it was off. The sound echoed into the night, and the dogs quieted down. Feeling bold, I shouted, "Get off our land," at the top of my lungs. I figured that would do the trick. When I walked back inside, my sisters were laughing at my overly dramatic cowboy act, and I couldn't help but laugh too. But our laughter didn't last long. The dogs started barking again, this time even more aggressively. I rushed back outside, and that's when I saw him. A man, standing about 20 feet from the dogs, right at the edge of the cornfield. He was just standing there, staring at me. My adrenaline spiked, and I shouted, "Hey!" As soon as I did, he turned and bolted into the cornfield. I ran a few steps after him and fired another shot into the air, but I stopped short of entering the field. There was no way I was going in there. Instead, I unclipped the dogs from their chains and brought them inside. I told my sisters what had happened. We called our dad, and he told me to man up and protect the house. His suggestion? Fire another warning shot if the guy came back. We all eventually retreated to our rooms, still shaken. My sisters each took one of the dogs into their rooms for protection, and I brought the gun with me to mine. I opened my window slightly, keeping an ear out for any strange noises. I tried to distract myself by watching a movie on my laptop, but then I heard it again. The whistle. This time, it was close, too close. I froze and looked out the window. There he was, a man, walking slowly across the grass. And then, like he could sense me watching him, he stopped and turned to face my window. He kept whistling, staring directly at me. My hands shook as I grabbed the gun. I aimed it out the window and fired at the ground a few feet away from him. He stopped whistling and took off running, disappearing around the side of the house. I slammed the window shut and locked it. My sisters ran into my room, panicked, and I assured them the guy wouldn't come back. He'd have to be a complete idiot to return after that. The rest of the night was eerily quiet. None of us slept much. We never found out who that man was or why he was there. Maybe it was some teenager pulling a sick prank. Maybe it was something more sinister. Whoever it was, They haven't come back since. But that night changed the way I feel about this farm. The isolation that once felt peaceful now feels dangerous. And while my parents still dream of me taking over this place, I know one thing for sure. I'll never feel truly safe here again. What would you have done in Howard's situation? Would you have handled it differently? Or was he right to fire warning shots to scare the intruder away? I used to work the night shift as a restock worker at a supermarket in a rural town. The store was called Great America, and it was the biggest and most popular supermarket in the area. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was steady, and the hours gave me the quiet solitude I sometimes needed. My shift started as soon as the store closed at 10 p.m., and I'd usually work until around 3 a.m., restocking shelves and making sure everything was ready for the next day. Usually, I worked with one other person, either Terry, Carter, or Alfonso. Tonight, it was supposed to be Terry. When I arrived at the store, I unlocked the back door with my key and let myself in. The store was silent, except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint sound of the cooling systems in the freezers. I always started my shift the same way, heading to the back storage room to grab a pallet of boxes with the pallet jack, wheeling them out onto the shopping floor, and organizing the aisles one by one. That night, I started with the bread and nuts aisle. It was mundane, repetitive work, rotating the older loaves to the front, placing the fresh ones in the back, but it allowed me to zone out and lose track of time. About 15 minutes in, I realized I hadn't seen Terry yet. Normally, he'd already be in the back room by the time I arrived, prepping his cart or starting on his own section of the store. I decided to check the back room, just in case he had come in without me noticing. The back room was empty. His bag wasn't there, and there was no sign of him. Thinking he might just be running late, I left the back door cracked open with a door stopper to make it easier for him to get in when he arrived. Then I went back to work. After another half hour of working alone, I returned to the back room to see if Terry had shown up. He still wasn't there, but this time, I noticed the back door was shut. The door stopper, which I had wedged under the door earlier, was now lying outside on the ground. I hesitated. The stopper had been jammed under the door pretty tightly. Had Terry arrived and kicked it aside? Or had it somehow slipped loose? Feeling slightly uneasy, I stepped outside and called Terry's name into the night. My voice echoed off the walls of the empty alley behind the store, but no one responded. I went back inside and decided to call him. When he answered, his voice sounded groggy, like I had just woken him up. "Are you at work?" I asked. "No," he said. "I called in sick. Didn't they tell you?" A chill ran down my spine. If Terry wasn't coming in, then who had shut the back door? I told him about the door stopper being outside, but he dismissed it, saying it could have just come loose on its own. Maybe he was right. After all, this was an old store with doors that didn't always close properly. Still, something about it felt off. I decided to shake it off and get back to work. Maybe I was just imagining things. But a short while later, as I knelt on the floor restocking bread, I heard a loud sound echo from somewhere across the shopping floor. It was sharp, like a metal shelf being bumped into or something heavy falling. I froze. Someone was in the store. I stood up and cautiously walked down the center aisle, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the middle of the store, I stopped and looked down toward the far end of the dairy section. That's when I saw him. A man, dressed in black, walked past the end of the aisle, heading in the opposite direction. He was looking directly at me as he passed. My breath caught in my throat. Who was he? Another employee? A random customer who hadn't left before closing? Or someone else entirely? I quickened my pace, heading toward where I'd seen him. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice echoing through the store. I turned into the next aisle, scanning the shelves, but there was no sign of him. Then, at the far end of the aisle, I saw him again. He was standing perfectly still, facing me. As soon as I made eye contact, he turned and disappeared around the corner. I started to run, my shoes squeaking on the tile floor. "Excuse me," I yelled again, this time louder. But when I reached the next aisle, he was gone. My unease was growing by the second. I walked toward the front of the store, hoping to find him near the cash registers. Instead, I saw him again, this time in the bread aisle. Half his body was hidden behind the shelves, and his mouth hung open in an unsettling, toothy grin. He waved at me. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was slow, deliberate, almost mocking. "Who are you?" I shouted. He didn't answer. Instead, he disappeared behind the shelf again. I wasn't being paid enough for this. I ran outside and locked myself in my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. I called my boss and told him about the intruder. "There's some random freak roaming around the store," I said. "What do I do?" "Get him out of there if you can," my boss replied casually, as though this was no big deal. "Or call the police if you need to." I was not about to confront this man alone. I hung up and dialed 911. When the police arrived, I led one of the officers into the store, explaining what had happened. As we searched the aisles together, I spotted the man again. He was standing in the cereal aisle, perfectly still, staring at us. When the officer commanded him to come forward, the man complied without resistance. But as he was handcuffed and led toward the exit, he turned to look at me. His eyes were wide and unblinking, with dark bags underneath. He licked his lips slowly, his gaze locked onto mine. Then he smiled, a sinister, unnerving grin that sent a shiver down my spine. When the officer asked him why he was in the store, he simply said, "I was looking for a snack." After the police left, I returned to work, but I couldn't shake the image of that man's face. His smile, his wide eyes, the way he had been lurking in the aisles, it all stayed with me. Needless to say, I never left any of the doors open again. To this day, I still wonder, was he just a harmless weirdo looking for food? Or was there something darker at play? What do you think? Would you have confronted him? Or would you have stayed outside until the police arrived? Let's talk about it. Back when I was 19 years old, my friends James, Sean, and I did something incredibly stupid. Something I can look back on now and recognize as utterly reckless. But at the time, we lived for stupid stunts. It was our idea of fun. That's how bored we were in our small town in New Jersey, a place surrounded by woods and vacant houses, where the most exciting thing happening on a weekend might have been someone hosting a lame house party. James and I don't really talk anymore, but Sean and I are still close, and whenever we catch up, we always seem to come back to this night. This was the night that left a mark on all three of us. It was October, and spooky season was in full swing. People in town had always talked about this abandoned church that sat on a hill, hidden away at the end of a closed-off road. The place had a reputation. It had been abandoned for decades and was covered in graffiti, but what really kept people away were the stories, rumors of hauntings, strange happenings, and unexplainable noises. It was the kind of place you dared each other to visit as kids, but no one actually went through with it. Naturally, this made it the perfect spot for us to test our bravery. Sean came up with the genius idea. We'd bring his Ouija board to the church late one night. What could be more fitting? The plan sounded ridiculous, but James and I were game. I picked them up in my car around 11 p.m., and we drove straight to the spot. The road leading to the church was blocked off, so we had to park on the side of the road and hike up the hill on foot. Armed with flashlights and Sean's Ouija board, we trudged through the darkness, the crunch of leaves and gravel under our feet echoing in the cold October air. The church loomed at the top of the hill, surrounded by dense woods. It was an eerie sight, with its crumbling walls, shattered stained glass windows, and a broken front door that hung slightly ajar. The gravel parking lot was empty, of course, and the silence around us was almost oppressive. We used our flashlights to scan the area as we stepped inside, making sure no one else was there. The inside of the church was just as creepy as you'd expect. Peeling paint, broken pews, and an altar at the far end of the room, still intact but covered in graffiti. Sean wasted no time setting up the Ouija board. From his backpack, he pulled out 3 candles, arranging them in a triangle around the board before lighting them. The flickering candlelight was the only source of illumination as we turned off our flashlights, plunging us into near darkness. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The soft glow of the candles barely lit the space around us, and the shadows danced on the walls, making it impossible to tell if we were truly alone. We sat in a circle, our hands resting lightly on the planchette. Sean, being the most superstitious among us, took the lead. He opened with the classic line, "Is anyone there?" At first, nothing happened. Then the planchette started to move. James and I exchanged skeptical looks. I was sure one of them was messing around. Sean, however, looked deadly serious. The board spelled out a few random words, but before we could make sense of them, there was a loud cracking noise from the direction of the altar. We all jumped, our heads snapping toward the sound. It was like the sound of a large piece of wood splitting in half. We quickly grabbed our flashlights and aimed them toward the altar, but there was nothing there, just the empty, graffiti-covered space. "Must be the old wood," James muttered, though his voice wavered. We laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. But something had shifted. The joke stopped, and we started taking the Ouija board a little more seriously. We continued asking questions, but the planchette refused to move again. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. Then it happened, a sudden, sharp noise from the altar area. Before any of us could react, something small and heavy landed on the Ouija board with a loud thud, making all three of us scream. Sean's flashlight revealed a rock about the size of a golf ball sitting on the board. We froze, staring at each other in wide-eyed terror. None of us had moved. None of us could have thrown it. Without saying a word, we bolted. We left the Ouija board, the candles, everything. Our footsteps thundered down the hill as we ran back to my car, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We didn't stop until we were all sitting in the car, gasping for breath and looking back at the hill, half expecting someone, or something, to follow us. Back at James's house, we sat in the driveway for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. Sean, being the religious one, was convinced we'd made contact with a spirit. James and I weren't so sure, but the idea that someone else might have been in the church with us was just as terrifying. The next day, Sean decided to go back for the Ouija board. He managed to convince James to go with him, but there was no way I was setting foot near that place again. When they got there, they found the candles exactly where we'd left them, but the Ouija board was gone. Sean swears to this day that we encountered something supernatural that night. I'm still not sure what to believe. Was it a spirit, or was someone messing with us? Either way, it's an experience I'll never forget. And even now, years later, when I think about the sound of that rock hitting the board, I feel a chill run down my spine. Do you think the group encountered a spirit, or was someone hiding in the church, playing tricks on them? What would you have done in their situation? Years ago, I worked the night shift at a gas station to make some extra cash. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I'd clock in at 10 p.m. and stay until around 3 a.m., restocking shelves and keeping the place tidy for the morning crew. The gas station was in a quiet, rural town, and it wasn't unusual to go hours without seeing anyone. Most of the time, it was just me, the dim overhead lights, and the hum of the coolers. About 2 or 3 months into the job, this guy started coming in late at night, always around 2 a.m. He was tall, probably 6 feet, with long, greasy hair that looked like it hadn't seen a brush in years. He'd stumble in, by a tall boy, and leave, muttering to himself as he walked out. At first, I didn't think much of him. We got all sorts of characters coming through late at night, but after a while, he started to get weird. One night, he asked me my name. I told him it was Rob, and he just kept repeating it, laughing to himself like it was some kind of joke. "Rob, I like that," he said, cracking open the beer he'd just bought and taking a long sip. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and walked out, still chuckling and mumbling to himself. That night, I got curious. He never bought gas, only alcohol, and he always walked away from the station instead of driving. I watched him leave, but once he was off the property, he disappeared into the shadows. I assumed he lived nearby, though I couldn't imagine where. For weeks, he came in almost every night. Some nights, he'd barely say a word, just lean on a shelf, staring blankly at the wall. Other times, he'd chat with me, though his conversations never made much sense. One night, I asked him his name. He paused for a long moment, then said, "Bob?" It felt fake, like he was making it up on the spot, but I didn't push it. I just nodded and asked where he worked. That's when he laughed, a loud, jarring laugh that echoed through the empty store. "Work? I don't work," he said, his tone shifting from amused to bitter. "The government screwed me out of my job." He leaned closer, his face serious. "But you, Rob, I like you. You seem like you know what you're doing." I had no idea what that meant, but before I could ask, he turned and walked out. Then, one stormy night, everything changed. The rain was coming down hard, and the roads were empty. I was restocking chips when I heard the familiar ding of the front door. I turned, and there he was, Bob. But something was different. His hair was soaked, dripping water onto the floor, and his clothes clung to his body like he'd been standing in the rain for hours. He didn't say anything. He just stood by the door, staring at the wall, completely still. "Bob, are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't move. After a long pause, he said, "I did something really bad." His voice was flat, emotionless. My stomach dropped. "What did you do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need somewhere to hide," he said, walking past me toward the restroom hallway. The door creaked open, then shut behind him. I stood there, frozen. Something about him felt off. I didn't like the way he looked at me, or the way he said those words. After a few minutes, I decided to check on him. I grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter and walked to the restroom hallway. The door to the men's room was ajar, but when I pushed it open, the room was empty. The same with the women's restroom. He was gone. That's when the lights went out. The entire store plunged into darkness, leaving me standing in the pitch black. The storm outside howled, and the rain pounded against the windows. I switched on my flashlight and made my way to the back room where the circuit breaker was. As I entered the hallway, I heard it, a faint, wet squeaking, like someone walking in soaked shoes. My heart started racing. "Bob." I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The squeaking got louder, closer. I turned the flashlight toward the corner of the room, and there he was. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and he lunged at me, screaming, "I'm going to kill you." I stumbled back, swinging the flashlight at him. He clawed at my shirt, his nails digging into my back as I pushed him away. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, and didn't stop until I was outside, jumping into my car. I locked the doors, grabbed my phone, and called 911. When the police arrived, I led them into the store. They found Bob huddled in a corner of the back room, his soaked hair hanging over his face. He looked like a wild animal, his pupils blown wide, and he kept muttering to himself. They handcuffed him and led him outside, but not before he turned to me with a chilling grin and whispered, "You'll see me again." I didn't sleep that night. A month later, I found out who he really was. His name wasn't Bob, it was Martin. That same night, he had brutally beaten his ex-wife to death. He'd come to the gas station looking for a place to hide. After that, I quit the night shift. I'll never work alone at night again. Sometimes, I still see his face in my dreams, that unsettling grin, and I wonder, what if the police hadn't arrived in time? What would you have done in this situation? Would you have tried to confront him, or would you have run? Let's discuss. When I was 19, I was working as a delivery guy at a local pizza place to help pay for food, gas, and whatever else I needed back then. It wasn't a hard job. Just take the orders, box up the food, toss it in a bag, and drive it to the address. I must have done it 1,000 times by then, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. Sure, it could be repetitive, but the tips made it worth it. Most people would leave $3 to $5, and sometimes, if you got lucky, you'd get someone generous who'd give you $10 or more. That night, though, I had no idea just how not ordinary things were about to get. I got an order for a chicken parm hero and a single slice of pizza. Smaller orders like that rarely came with big tips, but I didn't get to pick and choose, so I grabbed the bag and headed out. The address was on a dead-end road, way out in a quieter, more rural part of town. As I drove, the houses became fewer and farther apart, and I started noticing long, empty stretches of woods between properties. It wasn't completely dark yet, maybe around 6 p.m., but it was that weird in-between time when the shadows start creeping in and the streetlights haven't quite kicked on yet. When I turned onto the road, I saw that it felt different. Off, maybe. There were no other cars, just a few houses that looked more like small farmhouses. One had an old RV sitting in the yard, and another was so overgrown with weeds and shrubs it looked abandoned. The address I was heading to sat next to that overgrown house. The place I was delivering to wasn't much better. It was small, weirdly shaped, and sat on a massive property that seemed oddly empty. All the lights were off, but the front door was slightly open, like someone had forgotten to shut it. I grabbed the food and headed toward the door, but just as I got closer, I heard it, a piano. Someone was playing this slow, repetitive melody, and even though it wasn't loud, it cut through the evening air in the eeriest way. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deeper inside the house, muffled by walls or maybe a door. I knocked on the open door and rang the bell, but nothing happened. The doorbell didn't even work. I stood there for a minute, unsure of what to do. The piano music kept playing, this same creepy, almost hypnotic tune. I decided to walk around to the back of the house, thinking maybe someone was in the backyard or the kitchen. But when I got back there, it was just chaos. The yard was a mess. Stuff was scattered everywhere, and there was even an old, rusty chain-link fence just lying in the grass. I knocked loudly on the back door, but no one answered. Through the glass, I could see into what looked like a storage room, and it was just as messy as the yard. By now, I was getting frustrated. I didn't want to just walk into someone's house, but I also didn't want to waste time standing around. So I called the pizzeria to double-check the address. The guy who took the order confirmed I was in the right place, so I went back to the front door. I gave it a push, calling out, "Pizza's here," as I stepped inside. The music suddenly stopped. That should have been my cue to leave, but instead, I froze. Then, from somewhere deeper inside the house, a voice called out, "Over here." The piano started playing again, the same repetitive tune as before. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide if I should stay or go. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for a while, and there were no lights on anywhere, making it hard to see. "I'm by the front door," I called out, not moving any farther inside. The piano stopped again, and the voice answered, "Yes, sorry. I have trouble walking. Could you bring it in here, please?" I hesitated. "What room are you in?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause, and then, "If you just walk through the living room, I'm in the dining room." Something about the whole situation just felt wrong. My gut was telling me to leave, but at the same time, I didn't want to abandon the order if this was just some old guy with mobility issues. So, cautiously, I started walking through the living room. The smell was stronger now, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. There was an opening ahead that led to what I assumed was the dining room. But instead of walking straight in, I stopped just before the opening and peeked around the corner. The dining room was empty. The piano was there, but no one was sitting at it. There was no one in the room at all. I felt my stomach drop. Quietly, I backed away, retracing my steps to the front door. My hands were shaking as I shut the door behind me and practically ran back to my car. I didn't even look back as I drove away, my heart racing the whole way back to the pizzeria. When I got back, I explained everything to my boss. I told him about the creepy music, the voice, and how no one was actually there. To my relief, he didn't push me to go back or call the customer to ask what happened. In fact, the customer never called us, which was probably the most unsettling part. Why wouldn't they call if they still wanted their food? That night, after my shift, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about the whole situation just didn't add up, so I decided to do a little digging. I looked up the address online, and my blood ran cold when I found out that the house had been foreclosed months ago. It had been vacant ever since. To this day, I have no idea what was really going on in that house. Was it a setup for a robbery? A prank? Or something even worse? I'll never know, but one thing's for sure. I'll never ignore my gut feeling again. What do you think was going on in that house? Could it have been a robbery attempt, a cruel prank, or something supernatural? Have you ever had a gut feeling that saved you from a dangerous situation? Share your thoughts.